The air inside the Sands Hotel dressing room in 1954 wasn't just thick with a blue haze of unfiltered Lucky Strikes and the sharp tang of expensive bourbon. It was heavy with something far more volatile, an unspoken, suffocating tension that threatened to unsettle one of the most lucrative entertainment partnerships in Las Vegas history. Outside, past the heavy velvet curtains and the hallway lined with framed photographs of past headliners, the Copa room was filling up with tourists in evening wear, high rollers fresh off winning streaks at the tables, and a scattering of industry insiders who had come specifically because word had gotten around that something had shifted between the two stars on the marquee. Nobody in that audience could have named what it was. They only knew, in the vague way audiences sometimes do, that the chemistry felt different lately, sharper at the edges, less playful than it used to be. Backstage, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was a small, cramped room where three men stood in various states of readiness, each carrying a private weight that had nothing to do with the show about to begin. On the velvet sofa sat Sammy Davis Jr., his head bowed, a thick white bandage covering the left side of his face. A stark, sterile reminder of the highway collision in San Bernardino that had nearly taken his life just weeks prior and had cost him his left eye. His hands, usually restless with rhythm even in stillness, sat folded in his lap. To his left stood Jerry Lewis, a man whose frantic, rubber-faced energy usually filled every square inch of room, but who was now vibrated with a strange, nervous energy that felt out of place at the occasion. Not the manic joy that usually preceded a show, but something tighter, more brittle. And leaning against a mahogany wet bar, his tailored tuxedo jacket unbuttoned just so, was Dean Martin. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't pouring a drink, which itself was unusual for a man who treated a good scotch the way other people treated a handshake. He was watching Jerry, and there was something in his posture, a stillness, an attentiveness, that suggested he already sensed what was coming, the way a man who has spent years around a particular kind of storm can feel the pressure drop before the first raindrop falls. For years, casual fans believed the eventual fracturing of Martin and Lewis and the complicated undercurrents within the wider circle of performers who would later be nicknamed the Rat Pack was simply the slow erosion of two men outgrowing each other, a matter of diverging ambitions and clashing egos, dollars and credits, and billing disputes accumulating year after year until the whole structure finally gave way. That version of the story isn't wrong. Exactly. Anyone who has read the contract disputes, the studio memos, the increasingly terse quotes each man gave to columnists in the mid-1950s, can see the shape of a partnership straining under the weight of two enormous, incompatible ambitions. But that version is incomplete in the way that official histories of any relationship are often incomplete. They capture the visible fractures, the lawsuits, the walkouts, the cold professional handshakes at press events, while missing the smaller, more human moments that never made it into any contract dispute or gossip column, the moments that happened behind closed doors and were witnessed only by whoever happened to be standing nearby with a cigarette burning down between their fingers. This is a dramatized retelling of one of those undercurrents, an attempt to imagine, through the lens of the men's well-documented personalities, their known history, and the broader emotional currents that shaped their partnership, what a night like this might have looked and felt like, and why an act of fierce, quiet loyalty toward a wounded friend could have permanently altered the emotional chemistry of one of the most famous comic duos in American entertainment history. It is not a transcript. It is a story built around real people and real events, filling in a human texture that history rarely preserves. To understand how three of the most magnetic entertainers on the planet reached a point where warmth curdled into distance, it helps to look past the neon glow of the strip and toward the fragile, complicated men standing behind the stage personas. Men who spent every night convincing thousands of strangers that they were larger than life, and every day quietly negotiating with lives that were, in their own ways, just as fragile and uncertain as anyone else's. To the post-war American public, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis seemed like lightning caught in a bottle. They were a comedy machine unlike anything audiences had seen, a perfect, almost accidental synthesis of composed, effortlessly handsome crooner and the manic, elastic-limbed man-child who broke plates, screamed non-sequiturs, and turned every stage into a controlled demolition. When they performed, there was no real script, or at least none, that mattered once the lights went up. Jerry would knock over a table. Dean would keep singing through the wreckage, occasionally shooting Jerry a sideways grin that told the audience this chaos was, somehow, an act of love. Reviewers struggled for years to explain exactly why the combination worked as well as it did. Some pointed to the visual contrast. The tall, composed Martin next to the smaller, rubber-limbed Lewis. Others pointed to something less tangible. The sense, communicated without a word, that underneath the anarchy, there was real affection holding the whole enterprise together. Audiences ate it up. Nightclub owners fought over booking dates years in advance. And by the early 1950s, Martin and Lewis were, by any measure, the highest-paid live act in American show business. Nightclub grosses that made club owners weep with gratitude, blockbuster returns on their Paramount pictures, television appearances that reportedly emptied streets and stopped foot traffic across entire cities during broadcast hours. But underneath the meteoric rise, something else had begun to calcify. Slowly and then not so slowly. Jerry Lewis, even in these golden years, was already showing the traits that would come to define both his genius and his difficulty as a collaborator. An obsessive, almost compulsive perfectionism about every detail of production, a hunger to be taken seriously as an artist and not merely the funny one, and a competitive streak that could turn even friendly interactions into contests for dominance. Whether or not anyone else in the room realized the contest was underway. He wanted control over the writing, the staging, the editing, eventually over the whole apparatus of his shared success, down to camera angles and lighting choices that most performers of his stature would have happily left to a director. He wanted the world, and especially the critics, to recognize him as more than a clown. He wanted to be seen as a filmmaker, an auteur, a serious artistic mind capable of things beyond physical comedy. This hunger wasn't irrational. History would eventually vindicate some of it, as Jerry went on to direct and innovate in ways that influenced generations of filmmakers who came after him. But in the moment, in the mid-1950s, it manifested as a kind of restless, gnawing dissatisfaction that made it hard for him to simply enjoy being half of the most successful act in the country. Dean, by contrast, carried his talent so lightly that outsiders sometimes mistook it for laziness. He was, in truth, a meticulous performer with impeccable timing and a singing voice that could stop a noisy room cold within 4 bars. But he had zero interest in being anyone's straight man in the diminishing sense of that phrase, the sense that implied he was merely there to set up someone else's punchlines. He wanted to work, to make good money, to sing well, to spend time with his family and his friends, and go home without unnecessary drama. This apparent simplicity was itself a kind of quiet confidence. Dean didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone, which made him both easy to work with and, in certain moods, maddening to a partner who thrived on intensity and validation. The press, not entirely fairly, began describing Dean as a passenger riding Jerry's rocket, the tuxedo-clad ornament standing next to the real star, the singer who happened to be along for the ride. It was a narrative that stung more than Dean ever let on publicly, gnawing quietly a pride that ran deep, Italian, working class, and largely unspoken. He had grown up the son of an immigrant barber in Steubenville, Ohio, in a household where you can complain about slights. You simply work harder and let your results speak. But being reduced again and again in print to a supporting prop in a story about someone else's genius was a particular kind of erosion, one that accumulated invisibly over years until it became something closer to resentment. And then there was Sammy Davis Jr., who did not have the luxury of merely managing an inflated ego or a public image problem. Sammy was navigating an America that wanted his talent every single night and refused in the same breath to let him walk to the front door of the hotels where he headlined. He was a dancer of astonishing, almost unbelievable speed and precision, a performer who had been on stage since he was old enough to walk, trained relentlessly by his father and his adopted uncle in the Wilmaston Trio, a man who treated every performance like a matter of survival because, in a very real sense, he was also a singer capable of genuine emotional depth, and an impressionist whose ear for voice and mannerism was so precise he could summon any star in Hollywood with eerie, almost unsettling accuracy, a skill that delighted audiences even as it occasionally, uncomfortably, reminded him of exactly how much of himself he had to submerge and reshape in order to be embraced by a mainstream white audience. By every account, Sammy was also a workhorse who rehearsed until his shoes filled with blood, determined to be so undeniably brilliant that no one could find an excuse to dismiss him. Touring with the Will Maston Trio through much of the American South, and even in supposedly progressive Las Vegas, he was routinely barred from staying in the very hotels where he was a headline act. Forced instead to find lodging in whatever boarding house or segregated rooming quarters would take a black performer, then return each night to command a stage in front of an all-white audience that adored him for 2 hours and forgot him completely, sometimes literally refusing to acknowledge him. Once the curtain fell and the house lights came up, he was, by more than one account from those years, barred from using the front entrance of hotels where his name was on a marquee, required instead to use service elevators and back stairwells, a humiliation dressed up as mere policy. It was, by any honest accounting, an exhausting and degrading way to live, a daily negotiation for basic dignity carried out by a man who wore his talent like armor, because it was often the only armor available to him. When Dean and Jerry crossed paths with Sammy on the nightclub circuit in the late 1940s, an improbable closeness formed, one that defied a good deal of the unwritten social code of the era. Dean, who had grown up scrapping in the working-class immigrant neighborhoods of Steubenville, had a lifelong contempt for bullies, snobs, and anyone who threw their weight around at the expense of someone smaller or more vulnerable, a trait that friends and biographers alike would point to again and again throughout his life. He recognized in Sammy a kindred spirit, raw, hungry talent, unwilling to complain, working twice as hard as anyone else in the room for a fraction of the respect. Jerry, for his part, embraced Sammy too, with intensity and physical affection typical of Jerry's larger-than-life personality, bear hugs, loud declarations of admiration, public gestures of solidarity that, whatever their occasional complications, were not insincere. For a while, the three of them formed an informal brotherhood, an early, unofficial preview of what would later crystallize as the Rat Pack, drinking together after shows in whatever backroom would have them, trading jokes long past midnight, quietly defying some of the era's rigid social boundaries by simply choosing to spend time together as equals, whatever the wider country thought about that arrangement. But equality forged backstage, in the after-hours glow of shared drinks and easy laughter, is a fragile thing, especially once real tragedy enters the picture and forces everyone's true character out into the open, stripped of performance and convenience. On November 19th, 1954, that fragile equilibrium was tested in the worst possible way. Sammy Davis Jr. was driving from Las Vegas toward Los Angeles, planning to record a soundtrack album, when his car collided violently with another vehicle at an intersection near San Bernardino. The impact drove the steering wheel column into his face with tremendous force, shattering bone, fracturing his skull, and destroying his left eye beyond saving. For a man whose entire identity and livelihood depended on physical precision, on the exact placement of a foot in a tap sequence, on knowing precisely where his body was in relation to a stage, a microphone, an audience, the injury was not merely painful. It was existential. The news moved through the entertainment industry like a shockwave, the kind of story that stopped conversations cold in restaurants and dressing rooms across the country. For agonizing days, Sammy hovered in critical condition at Community Hospital in San Bernardino, and nobody, not his family, not his management, not the two men who had built an entire cross-country reputation partly around performing alongside his talent, knew for certain whether he would live, let alone perform again. Newspapers ran updates on his condition alongside the day's headlines. Well-wishers, including a great many performers who barely knew him personally, sent flowers and telegrams. The uncertainty stretched on day after day in a way that left everyone who cared about Sammy suspended in a kind of helpless waiting. It was during those agonizing weeks that the true character of the people around Sammy came into focus, each in their own way, each responding according to the deepest patterns of who they actually were rather than who they appear to be under stage lights. Dean Martin, according to the accounts of those close to him, didn't call press agents or arrange photo opportunities outside the hospital. He worked quietly through private channels, making sure medical costs weren't a source of additional stress for a man who had nearly died, checking in without fanfare, letting his stoic exterior mask what those who knew him described as a genuine, deep concern for his friend. This was entirely consistent with the Dean Martin that friends and colleagues described across decades, a man allergic to public displays of sentiment, who nonetheless showed up quietly and reliably when it actually mattered, in ways that rarely made it into any newspaper column, because he made sure they wouldn't. Jerry Lewis, meanwhile, responded with the same outsized emotional intensity that characterized everything he did. He showed up, he made noise, he wanted updates, he wanted involvement. He wanted, in his own way, to matter to the recovery. There is nothing inherently wrong with that kind of loud, visible caring. Grief and worry don't come in only one acceptable shape, and Jerry's love for Sammy, by every account, was real. But those who watched closely noted a subtle undercurrent in Jerry's behavior even then, a tendency, perhaps unconscious, to make even someone else's crisis, in some small way, about his own role in it, about being seen as the one who would shepherd his broken friend back into the light, the benefactor whose devotion would be remembered and admired. It wasn't malice. It was simply the shape of a personality that had never learned how to occupy a room without also, somehow, occupying its emotional center. When Sammy finally emerged from the hospital weeks later, he was, understandably, a changed man. He had survived a catastrophic accident, but the cost had been steep. He had lost an eye, and with it, some of the depth perception that had made his legendary dancing possible, a loss that terrified him far more than any physical pain, because it threatened the very thing that had always made him undeniable. He carried a private terror that audiences would now look at him with pity, rather than the electric admiration he had spent a lifetime earning through relentless work. He worried, quietly and constantly, in the sleepless hours of recovery, that his career, the only life he had ever wanted, the thing he had sacrificed nearly everything else to build, might be effectively over at 28 years old. He began wearing a black eye patch, which became, almost overnight, both a symbol of survival and a stark, permanent reminder of vulnerability he had never had to carry before, not on top of everything else he already carried simply by walking to the world as a black man in 1950s America. It was during this delicate, fragile stretch of convalescence that Sammy made his way back to Las Vegas. Not perform, not yet his body and his confidence both still healing, but simply to be near the world he loved, to sit in the audience and feel some of the old warmth of the spotlight from a safer distance, to remind himself that the life he'd built hadn't disappeared along with his eye. He went to see his friends at the Sands, the two men he considered as close as brothers, expecting, as anyone in his position might reasonably expect, comfort and normalcy, the easy warmth of people who love him, treating him like himself and not like a tragedy. Whatever he was hoping for that night, it wasn't to become, even briefly, an object of ridicule among people he trusted with his most exposed self. The atmosphere backstage that evening already carried its own separate tension, one that had nothing directly to do with Sammy's arrival. The relationship between Dean and Jerry had been fraying at the seams for some time by then. The two men, according to contemporaneous accounts, spoke to each other only in the clipped, professional register required to get through a show, all the old, easy warmth compressed into something colder and more transactional. Jerry's hunger to control every aspect of their act, the writing, the staging, the billing order, the creative credit, had reached a new intensity by this point in their partnership, and there was a restless, competitive charge running through him that particular night, the kind that made him look for any opening to reassert his presence in a room, to remind everyone, including himself, that he was still the dominant creative force behind whatever the two of them built together. Sammy came into the dressing room slowly, his movements careful, his hand occasionally drifting up to adjust a fabric patch that still felt foreign against his skin, an unconscious gesture born of weeks of learning to live inside a changed body. For a rare moment, the usually chaotic room, a space normally filled with Jerry's restless energy, with writers pitching last-minute bits, with a general control bedlam that preceded any Martin and Lewis show, went quiet. Dean crossed the room first. His voice dropped into the low, warm register that people who knew him described as unmistakably genuine. No performance in it. None of the stagecraft he could turn on and off at will for an audience. He put an arm carefully around Sammy's shoulders, mindful of the still healing injuries, and said something simple and unremarkable. The kind of low-key greeting that doesn't call attention to anything, that treat a friend exactly the way he was treated the day before the accident. No different, no diminished. He didn't mention the patch. He didn't bring up the crash. He simply treated Sammy like the performer and the man he had always been, which, for someone in Sammy's position at that exact moment, may have been the single most valuable gift anyone could offer. Then Jerry stepped forward. What exactly was running through Jerry Lewis's mind in that moment is something no outside account can honestly claim to know with certainty. Whether it was pre-show nerves, an old habit of needing to be the loudest presence in any room, an unconscious discomfort with Sammy's visible injury that curdled into something defensive and cruel, or simply a catastrophic failure of judgment in the face of an emotionally complicated reunion. What's clear, in the way the story has been told and retold informally by those who lived through that era of Las Vegas nightlife, is that Jerry, in this dramatized version of events, chose comedy where comfort was needed, and the joke he reached was cruel in a way that cut on two fronts at once, touching both the racial realities Sammy lived with every day and the raw, still healing trauma of the accident itself. It landed the way such things always land in real life. Not as levity, not as a familiar, affectionate ribbing that close friends sometimes trade, but as a small, sharp act of humiliation dressed up in the costume of familiarity. The room went silent in a way that had nothing playful in it. A couple of writers in the corner, who had been half listening while running through the night's bits, froze mid-conversation, suddenly very interested in the floor. Sammy's posture stiffened. Whatever composure he'd carried into the room evaporated in an instant, replaced by something raw, shock, humiliation, and a hurt made sharper by the fact that it came from someone he considered a brother, someone whose earlier bear hugs and loud declarations of love had made this moment feel, for a split second, like a genuine betrayal rather than simply a bad joke. Before things could go further, Dean moved. Those who described the moment afterward, in the second hand, informal way such stories circulate through an industry built on gossip and memory, remembered it less for volume than for the sudden, absolute shift in Dean's demeanor. The easy, half-lidded amusement that seemed to be his permanent expression disappeared entirely, replaced by something colder and more focused than anyone in that room had likely seen from him before. His jaw tightened. He crossed the room, took hold of Jerry, and in a low voice, not a shout, nothing theatrical, nothing performed for effect, made it unmistakably clear that whatever had just happened would not happen again. The exact wording of what passed between them that night has never been reliably documented in any verified historical source, and any dialogue attributed to either man beyond this basic outline should be understood as a dramatized reconstruction rather than verified history. But the substance of the message, as this kind of story has been passed down informally over the decades among old Las Vegas hands, was simple and unambiguous. This was a line, and Dean was drawing it, and he intended to hold, regardless of what it might cost the partnership going forward. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Heavier, more final. The kind of silence that settles over a room once something has genuinely changed rather than merely been interrupted. Jerry's face reportedly drained of color. Whatever had prompted the joke, whatever instinct had made him reach for cruelty instead of comfort, the full weight of what he'd done seemed to land on him only after Dean's response made it impossible to ignore or laugh off. He looked, in that moment, for the version of Dean who usually let things slide, who absorbed friction with a shrug and a joke of his own, the easygoing partner who rarely pushed back on anything. That version of Dean was not in the room anymore, at least not for these few seconds. In his place was a man who had just made unmistakably clear where his loyalties sat, and what would cost anyone who crossed that particular line, however close a friend or partner they might otherwise be. The immediate aftermath of a moment like that rarely resolves itself cleanly, and this one, in this retelling, didn't either. Jerry, by most accounts of his character during this period of his life, was not a man built for easy apology. His pride made contrition difficult even when he knew, on some level, that he'd been wrong, and the shame of having been called out so directly, in front of witnesses, likely made an immediate apology feel even less possible than it might have otherwise. Whatever passed between the three men in the minutes after, the emotional temperature of the room had changed permanently. The invisible thread that had allowed Martin and Lewis's chaotic stage chemistry to work. The underlying sense, beneath all the plate smashing and screaming, that these two men genuinely loved each other and were having fun at each other's expense rather than truly hurting one another, had been pulled taut and, in some quiet but real way, had begun to fray past the point of easy repair. When they went out to perform later that night, audiences in the Copa room likely noticed nothing different. The bits still landed. The songs still soared. The audience laughed in all the usual places, applauded at all the usual moments, and went home entirely unaware that anything of consequence had happened backstage only an hour earlier. But those closest to the two men, watching from the wings or seated near the stage with the practiced eye of people who had seen this act dozens of times before, described a subtle shift in how Dean and Jerry related to each other on stage from that point forward. The glances between them carrying a little less warmth, the timing feeling a shade more mechanical, professional rather than instinctive, as though two men who had once genuinely enjoyed sharing a stage were now simply very good at appearing to. Dean, by nature undemonstrative, didn't need to say anything more about what had happened. He simply performed with the same precision as always, but with an emotional distance that those who knew him well could read, even if the paying audience couldn't, a kind of invisible wall that hadn't existed in quite the same way before. For Sammy, watching all of this unfold from a booth later that night, nursing a drink, his patch catching a low light every time he turned his head, the episode became something of a private turning point. Not because it resolved anything about the daily realities he faced as a black performer in a segregated country, which continued largely unchanged regardless of any private moment of loyalty backstage, but because it clarified, in a single unmistakable moment, the difference between two kind of loyalty that he had, up to that point, perhaps not fully distinguished between. There was a loud, performative kind, full of hugs and declarations, that could nonetheless curdle into something careless or even cruel under pressure, when the person offering it was more focused on a display of caring on the actual needs of the person being cared for. And there was the quieter, less showy kind, the kind that didn't need an audience, didn't ask for credit, and simply showed up as an unbreakable line when someone he cared about was hurting, without ever making production of having drawn it. Sammy, by his own later reflections on friendship and loyalty in the entertainment business, reflections scattered across interviews and memoirs he gave in later decades, seemed to value the second kind far more, having encountered so relatively little of it in an industry built substantially on surface, image, and spectacle rather than genuine substance. The rift between Dean and Jerry widened steadily over the following 2 years, driven by a tangle of professional disputes, competing ambitions, and accumulated resentments that had been building long before this particular night, and would have likely surfaced eventually regardless. This incident, whatever its exact contours, wasn't the single cause of their eventual split. The real, documented story of the Martin and Lewis breakup is more complicated, tied up in contract disputes, disagreements over creative control of their films, disputes over billing and credit, and two men who had simply grown into very different people, with very different professional appetites than the ones who started performing together a decade earlier as two hungry young men trying to make a name for themselves. But for those who witnessed nights like this one, whether this specific version of events or others like it, moments like these came to represent something symbolically important in the private mythology of the partnership, a moment when Dean's tolerance for Jerry's need to dominate every room, regardless of the human cost, visibly ran out, and could no longer be waved away as simply part of Jerry's personality. On July 24th, 1956, 10 years to the day after their first official show together at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, Martin and Lewis performed their final act together as a duo at the Copacabana in New York. The date's symbolic symmetry was not lost on anyone in the industry at the time. 10 years to the day, a decade of extraordinary success ending in a partnership too strained to continue. It would be the better part of 2 decades before the two men spoke to each other again in any meaningful way, a rift that became one of the most famous professional breakups in American entertainment history, eventually and only partially mended, most famously during a surprise reunion orchestrated by Frank Sinatra on a Jerry Lewis telethon broadcast years later, a moment that reportedly left both men and much of the watching audience in tears, a public reconciliation for a rift that had, by then, become part of American entertainment folklore. Dean Martin went on, of course, to become one of the central pillars of what the world would come to know as the Rat Pack, alongside Frank Sinatra and, crucially, Sammy Davis Jr. himself. In that later circle, looser, cooler, built around mutual respect and shared professional stature rather than the earlier act's manic, unequal codependency. Sammy was never treated as a charity case or a curiosity to be tolerated at arm's length. He was an equal among a small group of enormously famous men, and by numerous accounts from that era, Sinatra and Martin both made a point of standing by him in moments when hotels or clubs tried to treat him as anything less than that insisting, when necessary, that if Sammy wasn't welcome somewhere, none of them would perform there either. A form of leverage that men of their combined stature could actually exercise, and reportedly did more than once. Whatever precise, unrecorded details of any single dressing room night. The broader shape of this story reflects something that seems to hold up reasonably well across the more reliably documented history of these three men. That friendship, in an industry built substantially on image and performance, is measured less by the warmth people display in public and more by what they're willing to risk quietly when someone they care about is at their lowest, stripped of the usual armor of talent and charisma that carries a performer through an ordinary night. Dean Martin was, by nearly every account from those who worked closely with him across his long career, a man of relatively few words who nonetheless made those words count when it mattered, who reserved his intensity for the moments that actually deserved it rather than spending it constantly like so many performers around him did. The lesson embedded in a story like this one, whether experienced exactly this way on one particular night in 1954, or absorbed more gradually across years of smaller, less dramatic moments that never made it into any single dressing room confrontation, is that real strength rarely announces itself. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need to be witnessed to count. It shows up quietly, draws a line when a line needs drawing, and does not apologize afterward for having done so. If you found this look behind the curtain of Hollywood history moving, feel free to subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates classic entertainment history and the complicated, very human men who built it. Before you go, here's something worth sitting with. Have you ever had a moment where a friend unexpectedly stepped up to defend you at your lowest point when you least expected it and most needed it? How did that moment change the way you saw them, or the way you saw the friendship itself in hindsight? Share your own story in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.